Seems as though things have stabilized internationally. We're seeing a better performance of global indices in general, many of them closing in the red. The oil price still high but stable. So it doesn't seem as though the world feels as threatened by the situation in North Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, obviously, Egypt is a very important region and market, not only for Africa or Middle East, but globally. But we've also seen very strong data coming out, and there was strong US jobs data on Friday. So it definitely spurred all the markets forward, which was really nice. So there was a lot of more positive risk appetite, you could say, over the past week or so.
Okay, you mentioned Egypt, and we know that finally the bourse reopened. They've recovered ground 6.6%. Explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, Egypt's been fascinating watching. I mean, we've all followed the trials and tribulations over the past couple of months. There's been a lot of downs and some ups. It opened about 2 weeks ago, and it was 12% down in the 2 days. So that's really kind of come back now. So the index is basically where it was pre the closing. And that's very important. As I was saying, it's an important region and market, not only for Africa, for the Middle East, but also for the world. So it's a very pleasant situation. And African investors, I think, are finding a lot more comfort, and coupled with the fact that risk appetite is back, it's a much more positive feeling.
Okay, so African investors finding a lot more comfort moving Africa funds into Egypt, but that doesn't seem to have resonance with Tunisia, where, again, they're really sort of managing their transition a bit well.
Yeah, very much so. You would have thought Tunisia would follow Egypt, but I think Tunisia, in this case, is actually following Morocco, which we'll get to later, is obviously one of the worst performing, it's in fact the worst performing bourse. Tunisia and Morocco have both been open for a lot longer than Egypt, so I think what's happened is Egypt's played a bit of catch-up, and they've probably played a bit of catch-up coming back down. And Morocco, while we're on the situation, it's the worst performing bourse. There we've had some really bad results coming out, and particularly on last week Friday, a lot of the names across the board were trading limit down, which is 6%. Morocco Telecom, which is the biggest on the bourse, was down a lot, so it's definitely being hampered over there.
JSE All Share Index up 2.5%. Is it largely just tracking this positive global sentiment after US jobs data?
Yeah, very much so. It followed the Dow and other indices up. There was also some currency strength. So definitely that, with the risk appetite, is definitely showing on that side.
Okay, interestingly, the Kenyan NSE 20 is starting to look a lot brighter, and this has been one of those inexplicable phenomenon. The results have been stellar coming out of Kenya. Growth prospects look very good, worrying maybe inflation, but the market has been subdued throughout early 2011. So what's this pickup then?
Well, you're right, and you were talking about Kenneth just before me. I mean, it was 12% down for the year, so it's a pleasing pickup. I think it's interesting. Equity Bank came out with the results on that day, traded down after good results, so it was very difficult to explain. But I think we saw a couple of phenomena, and as we said, with Egypt being closed, the next biggest markets in sub-Saharan Africa is Nigeria and Kenya, so you've got a lot of the filter coming down from Egypt to Nigeria and Kenya. So there's been a lot of uncertainty. I think now investors are getting more comfortable, and they've got funds to put back to work.
Right.
So you're seeing a lot of international players coming back into the game. And then the other thing to remember is it was quarter end last week, Thursday, so a lot of players are putting funds to work just before and over that period.
So about the worst performing, you've mentioned Morocco, a situation of poor results from some of the biggest stocks like Morocco Telecom. In Zimbabwe, we're getting a mixed picture. The industrial index is down 2.5%, but the mining index seems to have gained 1.9%. We know that the government has come out strongly now, even gazetted the guidelines for indigenization in the mining space, but that didn't seem to reflect.
No, you're right. And it's quite worrying, actually. I mean, a lot of big players in Zimbabwe, big international players who trade in Zimbabwe, are quite concerned about these new laws. You would have thought it would have impacted mining, but you've also got to remember mining is only 4 stocks. And sometimes in very thin trading, it can actually be affected by 1 or 2 trades. I think you've got to look at the industrial overall to get a better feel for the country.
Right.
And there we are seeing trouble. There is all the political noise, and there's a lot of uncertainty. However, I was just on a call with the guy from the States just before I came here, and he loves Zimbabwe, and he still does. And he says you've got to take the punt when the news is bad. Once the news becomes good, it's often priced in already.
Index that seems to be flat is Malawi. Is it worth mentioning?
No, not really. I mean, it was pretty flat, and the currency was down slightly. It's not nothing much to report on that.
You mentioned Nigeria earlier on and basic investor perceptions. Now we know that elections, there's been a lot of expectation about the conduct of these elections. They're the most expensive elections in Nigerian democratic history, and now these logistical problems.
Yeah, very much so. And there's always the conspiracy theorists who come around. But from what I've heard, it definitely was logistical issues with not enough ballot papers being available. But it's been very mixed. And I think the problem we face in Nigeria is it must portray a consistent message. We received emails last night that it was suspended today. I heard you saying earlier, that the election was meant to be held today, but now it's been postponed till Saturday. So it's important to have a consistent message. The elections are important for sub-Saharan Africa, so we've got to hope that goes well going forward.
I think it's an ominous situation for the newly appointed CEO of the Nigerian Stock Exchange, who begins his tenure today. He comes with a wealth of experience from New York, for instance, and he now needs to manage this kind of crisis on his very first day at work.
Yeah, for sure. But I think what's important is he's a full-time employee now. They had the interim governor before, so it's nice to see, and hopefully, again, it provides some consistency. The consistency if the elections go well, if he does a good job. And the other thing you're seeing is bank results. We haven't spoken about that, but bank results are midway through reporting. So far, there's been quite a consistently positive theme. So hopefully that is another thing. We need that consistency coming from Nigeria.
We've run out of time, but very briefly, I want us to talk about Ivory Coast, because the city is burning Abidjan as forces loyal to Alassane Ouattara make their way firmly into the city to grasp and get a hold of that city. It's an ugly situation. What's the situation? Because effectively the stock exchange had suspended its operations in Abidjan, moved to Mali. What's the status now?
Well, in theory, it's open. But the reality is it's very much not really happening. A few locals are playing, but what's happening is some of the big custodian banks are still not operational. So the foreign investors who have the custodian banks can't actually trade because trades can't actually settle. But it's very ugly and it's very worrying. Our local employee there that actually had some bullets put through the living room. So it's frightening for them. But we just try and do what we can do. Internet's down. That's another problem. So we just watch that very, very closely.